There are many obstacles that can block the path to a successful software project. When you come across one, it helps to think like a seasoned hiker and follow the trail marked by blue blazes around the problem so that you can get back on course and keep moving forward. Welcome to Blue Blazes Podcast. I'm your host for the journey, Jay Tower, and I'm a partner and principal consultant at Trailhead Technology Partners. In this series, we talk with industry experts who share their best tips for avoiding the pitfalls on the path to successful software projects. In this episode, I speak with Cory House. Cory is a Pluralsight author, Microsoft MVP, international speaker, and independent consultant. Cory is the founder of React JS Consulting, where he trains teams and helps companies transition to the React ecosystem and improve their front-end development practices. He's trained over 10,000 software developers at conferences and businesses worldwide. He specializes in JavaScript and React. Cory is the author of multiple Pluralsight courses and is active on Twitter at HouseCor. That's HOUSECOR. In this episode, Cory and I talk about custom dev tools and how using them can improve your web applications. Let's get started. All right, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being on Blue Blazes, Cory. Nice to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, it's our pleasure. So, as you know, the Blue Blazes podcast has a theme, which is trying to make software projects, which are notoriously difficult, more predictably successful. So when I invited you to be on the podcast and said, what would you like to talk about on that theme? You said custom tools, which I feel like requires just a little bit more definition. So you want to start out by just kind of telling us what you are thinking when you say custom tools?
Yeah, I think it starts by thinking about what we mean by dev tools in general. So we know that if you've got a web browser, you can hit F12 and see the dev tools in there. And the dev tools give you things like a network tab and performance tweaks and being able to see elements behind the scenes and manipulate them. So as a web developer, we use those tools a lot. Now, what I have found, though, is as a developer working on any web app, I tend to want to build my own tools. And those tools are different for every single application that I work with. But what I've found is the time that I spend investing in those tools tends to be well worth it because it's slowing down a little bit so that I can create things that help me move faster. And it's sort of analogous to the conversation around automated testing, where we know automated testing is a little bit of extra work, but in theory, it should help us move faster and write better code in the future. So what these dev tools look like tends to be technically quite simple. It's imagine a div with some form fields on it. And it might be something like a dropdown that lets me select what user I am. Or it might be some canned responses that let me say, when I make an HTTP request to get a user, instead of you returning the regular response, I want you to return this mock response that might contain some special data within it. Mm-hmm. So the very foundation of this sort of thing tends to involve stepping back one level from what I just talked about and getting to the point where we say, what is our canonical mock data set for our application? And I found that's a conversation that doesn't tend to happen at companies, but when it does, it's so powerful because you pivot from a situation where you have this sort of ad hoc scenario where people write automated tests and they think off the cuff and say, okay, I'll test for this scenario or that scenario. But once you have a canonical mock data set, now you're in a situation where you can say, someone opened a bug. And the fact that that bug exists tells me two things. For one thing, it tells me we've never written an automated test for it. And also, most likely, we don't have any mock data that simulates this. Otherwise, we would have probably already noticed the bug during development.
Right.
So we tend to step back and we say, all right, now in this situation, my first job is enhance the mock data set so that I can reproduce this bug. Go ahead and see it happen, write an automated test, expect it to be read. then write my fix so that it goes green, refactor as needed. So it's the usual TDD flow here that we're talking about. But the beauty of this is my mock data set is assuring that all the weirdness that's in my application's data is strategic. It's there because we've decided this is an edge case that we know can exist in production. And so this can obviously be informed by looking at your database schema and saying, all right, we know that this foreign key may actually not exist. So we need to think about how that manifests on the front end as well.
Yeah.
But this conversation about mock data set and custom dev tooling for me is fundamentally connected because one really builds upon the other.
Would you say that really that mock data set in a way is a custom dev tool? Like you've come up with a custom data set that you want to kind of be part of your test to hit all the different, features or functionalities of your application. Is that in your mind? Is that a custom tool too then?
Oh, sure. Yeah. It all depends where you want to draw those lines. Some people think about data just as data, but it is definitely directly connected to this conversation. So yeah, I think that's totally a fair characterization.
So maybe the tooling is actually the whatever you use to set up that data, so that you can kind of like click a button and have an environment set up with your test data, something like that.
Well, that's certainly an option too. And actually, I pause for a second as you say this because it's not something that I normally do. When it comes to the mock data creation, I tend to, there's a couple things here. For one thing, I tend to work in TypeScript because I like the structure that comes from those types. So because of that, I will tend to create a type that enforces a certain structure for my mock data. And you might think, why would I need dedicated types for my mock data? Well, recognize I would use the production types, but I will augment those production types for mock data so that I can add basically one thing, which is a description field that lets everybody know why this particular element exists. So the reason this is important is I've noticed companies will create mocks and mock data sets, and I'll look at this array of values, but I won't know why they are that way. So recognize that data itself has no metadata around it. So if you show me a user and this user has, say, an ID and a first name and a last name, and then I notice, for instance, that their email is empty. Well, it would be nice if there were a description on that particular user record where it said user with empty email. And that way I know that was someone's intent from the very get-go. That's what makes this particular mock record important, unique. And that's also important because it helps avoid me doing something like going in there and populating that email just so I can serve some other purpose over here. And I don't realize that I'm actually messing someone else up.
Right. Maybe it was there to test what the system does with an empty email. Maybe that's not allowed and you just messed it up, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so what I hear you saying is that, we all as developers have lots of tools that we use, VS Code and obviously the frameworks and libraries that we're using, whatever IDE you like, whatever compiler or CLI you're using for your particular application. And then there's this, what you're kind of talking about here is this layer on top of that, where you create tools that are more built for your particular application, but aren't really part of the application itself. Maybe they're to help you test it. Maybe they'll help you develop it more quickly. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yes. Yeah. And technically, all I'm really talking about is a div. Okay. You boil it down to that. So imagine that you've got a web application, and then you can set an environment variable like show custom dev tools. And if that environment variable exists, you render a div. Now, I'm boiling it down to its essence because that div could be as complicated as you want it to be. Yeah. But that div is rendering all the custom settings that allow me to change the way that my application runs. And so some examples of that are going to be things like I want to be able to change what user I am without having to click log out and then remember a username and password that associates with this admin user versus this traditional user and so on. I just want to select from a drop down that gives me a list of our different users. And other examples are if I'm working with an application that has feature toggles, well, what I'd like to do is just check boxes or change radios within that little div so that I can change the behavior of my application. So I don't have to go in and manipulate some system that might, for instance, have implications for other people. So imagine that you're using some sort of feature toggle service that's actually hosted on some cloud provider. Well, if I go change that in the dev environment, that means that it's shared mutable state effectively. And if I change it, that means if you and I are on the same team, now all of a sudden you're seeing that feature toggle too. So we really need a way to be able to simulate it changing using mocks in this case, keeping it local, controlling that sort of setup. Also useful for automated testing because I want to be able to assert that when the feature toggle's off, I don't see this thing. When it's on, I do.
Okay. So I'm thinking of I think you have a .NET background in your history too, right?
Yes.
You and I share that in common. So for those of us that have that are listening, I'm thinking of a really old tool for .NET called Glimpse. Do you remember this?
I do, yes.
I feel like what you're talking about is kind of like the modern version of that a little bit. Does that feel accurate to you? So for those who aren't familiar with Glimpse, do you care to describe it? Or since I just sprung it on you, do you want me to describe it?
You go ahead.
Okay. So if I recall how it worked, it was basically like what did they call it back then in the IIS days of ASP.NET? Like a web, not a web job, but anyway, it would basically grab a request before it got down far enough into the pipeline to get to ASP.NET, and you could like interact with the request there. And it would basically grab your HTML page as it was, or your request as it was coming in. It would measure a bunch of things that were going on in the back end, how long your entity framework queries were taking, and how many connections were open to the database, and how long each method in the call stack ran, and all that kind of stuff. And then basically it would grab that response coming back from the actual application and add a div to your point. It would add a div to your response that was kind of like collapsible down on the top or bottom of the page, and you could see all those stats. I hear you kind of talking about like a modern version of that.
Yeah, well, it's certainly similar in that way. Now, Glimpse, from my memory, and I mean, when you brought it up, I had to think for a second. I remember Nick Molnar was big into Glimpse, and it was a friend of mine. We traveled in a lot of the same circles at conferences for a while, and so yeah, it is similar in idea of saying, okay, I'm going to run my app, and I'm going to get this other thing on top of it. Yeah. I think exactly what it looks like, though. This idea is not really tied to performance or analytics or any particular manifestation. It's really just a matter of
whatever
what
you
would
want
it look
it for,
like if
right?
I had a toolbox for my particular app. So the thing that I found is since I work a lot with teams that work in React, because React has been my specialization for the last darn near decade now. And I found I keep creating these dev tools for different teams. So I've been increasingly looking for patterns that I can use to make that quicker. And I actually have an open source project that I'm iterating on right now. I'm still not at a 1.0, but the idea is, what if you just had a React component that you plop into your app that's called dev tools? And that gives you a frame to put these settings into. And it has a lot of built-in intelligence for things like where to place it on the screen, drag it around the screen, collapse it, having settings for intercepting HTTP requests and changing their responses, those sorts of things. So the hard thing about doing that is, since the targets are so different, since expectations are so different, I have to be very careful about how much opinion I put into this at all. So I'm trying to deliberately pave the paths that are universal and then make everything else easily customizable.
You mentioned you use it for like feature flags to turn off and on features to test that, but
Yep,
somebody else might want to use it for something totally different. So if you bake that in too deeply, then it's hard for them to truly customize, right?
exactly.
What do you find to be the most useful information that you, at least you, always put in there? Feature flags sound
Hmm.
like they're some sort of like config settings, maybe like
Hmm.
what environment is this running on, or those types of things are in there. What kind of stuff comes up a lot
The
when you're creating these?
the two that I find are near universal is what user am I, and
Hmm.
having an easy way to flip between those users, and the other one is configuring mock APIs. So
Okay.
mocking out every HTTP request that my application makes, and not merely saying, here's a single static response, but being able to select from a drop down of different potential responses for every single endpoint.
Hmm.
And the technical way that I tend to do that is using mock service worker, which is an open source project that runs a service worker within your browser and then captures every network request. Now, the nice thing about mock service worker is you can read an environment variable, and using that environment variable, only configure that mock service worker in development on your local machine, or potentially, if you want to, I actually put it to use in CI environments as well, just so I can check and make sure that uh, the automated tests are running effectively there. Because I'll use tools like Cypress or
Hmm.
Playwright to automate the browser to run these tests, and my automated tests run against these mocks so that they're reliable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Um, okay, so you've kind of described a little what you're thinking when you talk about these custom tools, essentially a div that you can do with whatever you need as a
Mm-hmm.
developer. A lot of it has to do with configuration and settings and testing. Um, what do you see as the upsides for improving the success of projects? So when you see a project that isn't using things like this, what are the pitfalls that they're going to run into more likely than if they are
Hmm.
using something like this?
There's a couple things. One thing that I'll find is two mistakes. One mistake is people changing source code on their local machine so that they can do development. But when they make those changes, they basically have to remember, don't commit this. I've just changed this locally because all I wanted to do was break this HTTP request temporarily or hard code it to send this weird response just so I could reproduce this bug. And then
Yeah,
I've got to remember to undo this. And
that's
I've
right.
worked with teams that actually have that sort of a mindset where they will have a half dozen files that are in that are changed right now that are shown, and Git says, hey, here's your change sets. And I go, what about these files? Oh, ignore those. It's just, I wanted to be this user and I wanted to turn on this feature. And I go, well, normally you would do that sort of thing via, for instance, an environment variable.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty common answer. You say, okay, well, let's use an environment variable to turn this feature on or to force this response. And that's okay, but recognize that environment variables are sort of a dull knife for this problem because you don't want to end up with a proliferation of
Yeah.
environment variables.
Right.
And environment variables cannot hold conditional logic. They are
Sure.
just values that allow you to fork your logic. So you
Yeah.
certainly don't typically want an application with dozens of environment variables to manage. What you want is some sort of a tool that makes it really easy to change these live. The other problem with environment variables is in most cases, if I change an environment variable, I actually have to kill the whole process, restart everything so that those environment variables are read. Whereas with dev tools running within the browser, I can change these values and it is instant because they are read at every single time that a request happens. So I can even do things like say, all right, I'm Bob. Now I go change the user. And the moment I change user, the application re renders as this new person. And the moment that I turn on this feature, I see it manifested. I don't have to wait for restarting the app or changing an environment variable. And that's part of why I feel like it's really important with these custom dev tools to have the mindset of this runs within my app, not
Mm-hmm.
not outside of it. Like you could, some people have asked in the past when I've shown these things, why wouldn't I do things like create a Chrome dev tool, for instance? And you could do some of the same things I'm talking about there, but the problem is it's not running within your app, so you end up
Right.
missing out on a whole set of power there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if your dev tools actually render your app, then you have 100% power about how to render your app, which is pretty cool.
Fully customizable.
Yes.
So that's the advantages. Those seem really great. You've already won me over. But let's say that I'm a stick in the mud and I'm thinking, okay, those dev tools you've been describing sound pretty high powered, impersonating a different user. That sounds a little dangerous to have it in my code base. What do you do to make sure that this stuff doesn't end up in production and everyone is clicking the special little button at the bottom that allows them to be anybody? Or
That's a valid concern. I do this via a single seam. I set an environment variable called show custom dev tools, or just show dev tools, whichever you prefer. And I only set that on my script for running the application during development. When I run a production build, I obviously would not set this, although there are times that I may actually want to run the production build with the dev tools just locally to try these things, but recognize that I'm assuming, for instance, that I'm working with a team that has an automated production build and automated deploy. So then we don't have to worry about any of this here. You've got a script for that, and it would not set this environment variable. So that's it in the end. And then the logic within my code is simply, if I'm supposed to load this thing, then I'm going to lazy load that JavaScript, at which point it's displayed on the page. And in React, for instance, that's an easy thing to do. React has a feature called react.lazy, which actually uses a Webpack lazy loading behind the scenes, typically assuming you're using Webpack. But in the end, a dynamic import of sorts is the idea here. So it's certainly not tied to React. You could do the same thing in all sorts of different front-end tech.
So would you say then, if you deploy the production app with that setting off, is there actually code that gets compiled out? Or do you still compile in all that code and just turn off those features visually?
Well, what happens is anytime that you lazy load a bundle, that JavaScript gets generated in a separate JS file.
Right.
And it would only be requested then if there were some source code that were requesting it. So what happens is, since that environment variable isn't set, although this one file that contains your dev tools would actually be deployed with your app, there would be no way to request it within the app.
Gotcha.
So it would just be dead. Now, given it's trivial to set up a process that would actually strip that from your production build if you're worried about it going out there, I haven't traditionally done so, because the actual manifestation of all this it's a very small amount of code typically here. So it's not like I'm worried about the bandwidth of pushing that.
Right. So last question from the perspective of a hesitant engineer. Some of these security things in an application depend on both the back end and the front end, agreeing on something. So just changing who the user is isn't necessarily something you could do just in the front end. You need something in the back end to kind of, issue a token or something. How do you go about integrating that into the back end in a way that's also secure?
So to some degree, I feel like the answer to your question is do whatever you would normally do if we hadn't had this conversation. You still need to write end-to-end tests. You still need to think holistically all the way back to the database. But this is a bit like a conversation around unit testing. And someone might say, well, if you unit test this function, you're going to end up maybe mocking out some dependencies. And I would say, well, yes, you're taking a risk there, but I'm not saying that the unit test is your only test. What I am saying is I have found I want to have a large number of integration tests that run against mocks so that I can have a high level of confidence that given this JSON I get from the server, my application is going to act exactly like I expect it to. But then there's a completely separate conversation to have around, given this request to this endpoint, does it reliably give me the JSON I want? And we could have conversations around contract testing for that sort of thing. You could write tests just for your backend. And in fact, I would say you should. So if we've got an endpoint here, we should have automated tests for that endpoint, so we're confident that it works the way that it should. But once we're confident that the backend returns a given response, then I should feel very comfortable mocking out that response. And the other conversation here too is, if that response were ever to change, we should be versioning our backend assuming that we're hitting some APIs that might be shared by a number of different teams.
Yeah, it makes sense. It depends on if you're trying to do it as more of an integration test or more of a unit test of some front end component, right?
Yes.
Nice. Okay. So I heard you reference earlier that you've been thinking about possibly packaging this up for people at some point. It sounds like it's not available yet. So if someone's listening to this or watching this and they feel like, oh, I totally want to do that, I don't know how to go about it, where should they get started? Should they send you an email and ask you to go ahead and publish that to GitHub?
Well, it is public. It's public on GitHub, and the working name for this is Switchboard. And I call it Switchboard because in the end, that's mostly what your dev tools will end up looking like, is a bunch of different settings. So I'm going to have form fields that do these things. And if you go out to my GitHub, so go to github.com/Cory House, CoryHouse, and there's a repository called Switchboard that contains all of this. What I have is a link to a React application, simple to-do app, but what I show is all the custom dev tools that make that to-do app very easy to test and easy to manipulate by changing who I'm logged in as, what all the requests are, and also things like how fast those requests even resolve. So I can force those mocks to be slow or quick, or to throw a 500 or a 404. And that way I can actually have automated tests that say, when I check this checkbox and I get a 500, the user experience should be that I see this particular error message on the screen. They should have a button to click retry. It should reload the application. And those are the sorts of things that, if you don't have custom dev tools, well, how the heck do you even write an automated test for it? Because now you need your app to reliably fail. So that's one of the reasons I'm a big fan of custom dev tools, having them set up that way. And another thing, if there's one thing I've learned too, is having these dev tools configurable via the query string is really useful too. So imagine that I've set all these settings and I've said, I want it to be this slow and I want it to return these responses and be Bob or Sally. Well, I can click a button called copy settings, and it's going to give me a URL that contains all those settings. I could send it over to you, Jay, and the moment you run the app, you're running it with those same settings. I could even put it into a ticket and say, if you configure the app this way, then we've got a bug, and here's what happens. And now somebody doesn't even have to go fiddle to go into a database and try to recreate it. They just have a link that they click, and the developer is looking at the bug.
Yeah, I love that. I love that link in the ticket. That's a great way to do it. Currently, I've got a lot of projects where there's just a long list of, if you're logged in as this person and this is true and you're on a Tuesday, and all the things that you have to do to reproduce the bug. So that would be awesome to just have a link. Well, this sounds really interesting. So that GitHub link again, if somebody wants to check that out, see how you went about accomplishing that, maybe contribute to it on GitHub. That's GitHub/Cory House, and then the project is called Switchboard.
That's right.
All right, cool. Well, I will definitely be checking that out after this conversation. So one of the things I also like to ask all of my guests at the end of our time together is, what other topics should be on our list of things that we want to talk about to make software projects more reliably successful?
The one that immediately comes to mind for me as 2023 arrives here is artificial intelligence, which has become, oddly, in the last few months, a large part of how I'm spending my time getting better. And it's that aspect of getting better, getting comfortable with, when should I reach for ChatGPT? How do I interact with GitHub Copilot in a way that is most effective? How patient should I be to wait for the AI to try to suggest something? Because sometimes it takes it a moment to do so.
Sure.
What should I be naming my variables, and what comments can I put in to get richer responses there? And even weird things like, how much of my job should I even be doing anymore? Like, we're in a very weird spot right now where I'm seeing more and more that I can ask an AI to do something and I get a response that is not perfect. Usually it's not perfect. And that may make some people say, well, why bother? But I can get something that is 80% 6% there, and it saves me a massive amount of time. Sure. So, and it's not that that our expertise is going to be useless anymore in the short term, but it is one of those things that to be competitive here soon, this is table stakes. And recently I've even started, so I do a lot of corporate training at companies. And I teach React to developers multiple times a year, lots of different teams. And now I teach using AI because I feel like it would be silly for me not to. And what I find is lots of people go, oh man, okay, I definitely need to be using this more because I could save so many keystrokes. Why not?
Yeah. Speaking of tools, right? This is another tool in the toolbox.
Yes.
I love how you point out that it's 80% of the way there. It's not like it reminds me of Stack Overflow. There's developers that will go search for what they're trying to accomplish and take the first answer, and then there's ones like hopefully like you and I that are more dubious about what we read there and like actually look at the algorithm and say, is this really what I want? What are the upsides and downsides to this approach? I feel like the same applies when you get the code back from an AI, which really is just going to places like Stack Overflow and looking at answers and like combining them together, right?
Right.
Well, that's a very timely topic. I think we will probably have to take your advice and talk about that soon.
Cool.
Well, Cory, thank you very much for your time and expertise. If someone wants to find you online, if they want to learn more about React or get you to come out and help them at their company with some React stuff, how do they find you?
I am House Core on Twitter, HOUSECOR, and my consultancy is at reactjsconsulting.com.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for your time. It was a really interesting conversation.
Thanks for having me, Jay.
Yeah, my pleasure. That's the end of this Blue Blazes podcast. If you're interested in hearing more conversations like this one with industry experts focused on how to make software projects more predictably successful, make sure to subscribe. Trailhead can be found online at trailheadtechnology.com, on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Until next time, thanks for listening.